Help support AMTV by becoming a patron, an AMTV staff member, and following us over on Twitter. Part of the cinema-going experience, a tradition nearly as old as motion pictures themselves, is the inclusion of a rating. Not a rating indicating the quality of the movie you're about to see, but a warning of sorts regarding the content itself. Whether it's a U-rated animation, the first 12 you see with your mates without an adult present, or even the intimidating 18s. Just what was so daring about those films anyway? In the UK, over the last century, the British Board of Film Classification, or BBFC, has been the main body that has overseen just what ratings films receive before they are distributed to cinemas, and from the mid-80s, also on home video. These symbols have become as commonplace to see on the big screen or on the spines of our VHS, DVDs and Blu-rays as watching the actual films themselves, but their iconic look has changed over time, so join me as we go back more than 100 years ago to see just how the BBFC ratings got their beginnings. The 1910s would see the evolution of the motion picture, ultimately leading to the silent era boom. Whilst creatives all around the world began to shoot movies of different kinds of genres here in Britain, there were some concerns as to what could, or even should, be allowed to be depicted on the silver screen. The British Board of Film Censors began operation at the beginning of 1913, partly in response to the furore generated by a movie released the previous year, From the Manger to the Cross, which, as you may have guessed from the title alone, was a showcase of the life of Jesus Christ. Now, initially, when the BBFC began to review films before they were shown to the public, they kept things nice and simple, with only 2 ratings coming into effect. An A rating indicated that the film in question was more suitable to an adult audience, seems pretty self-explanatory. The other rating is still very much in effect today, more than 100 years after its inception. That rating, of course, is U, which stood for Universal, essentially indicating that the film you were about to see was indeed suitable for all audiences, be they young or old. Whilst having just 2 ratings may seem like a good idea on paper, given the absolute explosion and evolution of movies throughout the 20s and 30s, I'm sure there were many titles released that didn't fully meet the standards of a U or an A certificate. Therefore, in 1932, it was decided a 3rd rating should be introduced, on a purely advisory basis. This was the H rating, which predictably indicated horror, or that the film in question would be somewhat horrific for audiences to watch. We're talking horrific by 1930 standards, of course, so the great monsters of Universal Studios, i.e. Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman and more, would all be subject to the new H rating, a moniker that ironically probably enticed more audiences to go and see the films in question. The BBFC throughout this early period truly reflected its name. Films made in Britain would be subject to extensive scrutiny and indeed censorship from the BBFC, something that seems largely unthinkable today. But of course, the pre-World War II Britain was a very different world from the one that we have today. Films that were brought in from Hollywood were largely left alone by the BBFC, frustrating British film producers even further, for they were severely limited in the subject matters they could tackle, for if deemed wholly inappropriate by the BBFC, then they may as well not even bother writing the script. After World War II concluded in 1945, with the Western world set to rebuild and ultimately embrace a freer way of life, something at the BBFC would have to give, and they would provide their offering of adaptation just a few short years later. The next major development of the BBFC rating system wouldn't occur until 1951. In a post-war Europe, a lot more experimental and quite frankly avant-garde films made their way to cinemas. To match the times, the BBFC debuted its new X rating. This would see the farewell of the horrific H rating, with it now being folded within the newer X variant. However, the major difference here was that the X rating strictly limited audiences attending to be at the age of 16 or over. Didn't meet that age? No admittance for you. The X rating would be seen across a wide variety of more realistic, often more daring motion pictures. Here in Britain, we too were experiencing a cultural renaissance. The numerous horror films from Hammer, most of which were made in the UK, found great success not just at home, but abroad in the United States as well. Many of their biggest successes carried the X rating. Fitting really, as Hammer throughout the late 50s and into the 60s were pushing the boundaries as to what horror-based cinema could both do and get away with at the film censors. As the 60s neared its end, the BBFC would remodel their ratings once again, with the main focus being a fresh new look. Since their initial introduction in 1913, the BBFC ratings had been presented on these slides. Contemporary for their time, you could argue that even post-war, their design feels a little antiquated, to say the least. Even with the introduction of the H and then later the X ratings, the style remained pretty much the same for more than half a century. Finally, in 1970, the design was updated to something a lot more modern. Old style certificates were out, new, more brutalist looking models were in. The U rating remained, but aside from that, everything was different in some way, shape or form. The X rating had its age restriction bumped up, now audiences had to be 18 rather than 16 to see an X-rated movie. The A rating also remained, although its meaning was completely overhauled. What was once used to denote a movie strictly intended for adult audiences was now purely an advisory rating. That is what the A stood for, advising older audiences that the upcoming film may be unsuitable for younger viewers. For the first time since 1951, a new rating was introduced, the AA variant. This interestingly titled rating denoted that admission only be granted to audiences who were aged 14 and above, providing sort of an intermediary rating between the advisory A and the strictly 18 and above X. The BBFC ratings you see here remained in effect throughout the 1970s, a decade in which movies weren't afraid to get gorier, sexier, and a lot more outrageous than ever before. It's often around this time you hear stories of youngsters trying to sneak in to 18-rated movies, with mixed degrees of success. With the 1980s looking to be an even more controversial and boundary-pushing decade in the world of movie making, the BBFC would adapt its ratings once again, and perhaps surprisingly, it would adapt itself as a whole, but more on that in just a minute.
All of us here in the newsroom wish you a very happy New Year.
1982 would be the year that would provide us with arguably the defining shape of the BBFC rating system, for the entire format would be overhauled and then some. To start with, the U rating would remain the sole survivor, its universal implications denoting films that were appropriate for the youngest of audiences. The advisory A rating was done away with, replaced by the intriguing sounding PG. This stood for parental guidance, and served much the same purpose as the former advisory A, meaning the film in question was generally suitable for all, but that some scenes within may be unsuitable for younger children. These two ratings were housed within triangles, as opposed to the box standard that had been in place since the 1910s. This was perhaps to try and help differentiate them from the new ratings that were coming in, as for the first time, the British Board of Film Censors would be going numerical. The AA variant was abandoned and replaced with the 15 rating, denoting exactly what it says on the tin, that no one under the age of 15 be permitted to a film with such certificate. The provocative X variant was finally done away with after 3 decades, made into the numerical 18 rating. Its role remained the same as the former X, that anyone under 18 not be permitted to view said rated film. There was one more new rating, the even more eyebrow-raising R18 restricted. This was to denote movies that showcased a lot more explicit sexual depictions, often for titles that amounted to straight-up pornography. Fair to say you wouldn't find this rating often, if ever, at your local cinema. The 1982 overhaul marks some major firsts and also some fond farewells. The introduction of the triangle-shaped ratings for the letters and spherical-shaped ratings for the numbers is a template that is still served today more than 40 years later. However, it meant audiences would have to say goodbye to certain ratings that they had spent perhaps their entire lives seeing at the start of every film that they went to see. The X rating, once a staple before any classic Hammer horror and many other films, was no more. The A rating, which by some definition or another had been around since 1913, was now also consigned to history, nearly 70 years after its inception. But in just a few short years, the new symbols on the block would undergo perhaps the most significant upgrade in BBFC history. A new splash of colour would adorn the BBFC ratings cards when audiences went to see films from 1985 onwards. Having been presented in monochrome variants for decades, the rating symbols now had their own specific colours, ones that would help make their impact on audiences even more pronounced and present. The everlasting U symbol was presented in a dark green triangle. PG was now backed by a yellow hue, 15 was a fair mix of red and white, and then 18 was definitively red, with only the numerical text itself being presented in white. Restricted 18 retained its rectangular shape, now with a blue background, but yet again, it wouldn't be seen by the majority of audiences. These colours would be defining for a generation, but it wasn't just in the world of cinema in which they would be seen time and time again. By 1985, the concept of home video, specifically being able to own movies on tape and watch them over and over again at your leisure, was a concept that was truly beginning to take off. Sensing that audiences, particularly parents, could benefit from these new videotapes being rated, the BBFC set to work at implementing their rating system on the burgeoning home video format. Also key to note that by this time, they had changed their name. They were still the BBFC, but that now stood for the British Board of Film Classification, arguing that was what their job now largely pertained to, and shaking off the criticisms that film censors had drawn them in decades past. Back to home video, the ratings remained unchanged, from U to restricted 18. VHS tapes up and down the country would bear these symbols, the only difference being slightly different colour palettes. Though by the end of the decade, they would be swapped out to mirror the film versions. In this 1985 wave, however, there was one new addition, and that was UC. This unique symbol bore more of the original U rating, with a smaller C added to the lower right corner of the triangle. This new variant denoted that the product it was attached to was not only suitable for all audiences, but was particularly suitable for children. This would be a huge help to parents, who could pick up videotapes for their children, often those with the UC rating, as they knew and could trust that that particular program would have no adverse effect on their child. Now with the home video market under their watchful eye, the recently rechristened BBFC had established a solid rating system, crafted and adapted over the past several decades to best serve British audiences with a clear guide as to what films would suit them and their families the best. Except there was one piece of the puzzle still missing, one that wouldn't be rectified until 1989. As the 80s prepared to give way to the 90s, the BBFC was facing a problem. The 80s had been a wonderful decade for film, but there were several titles, such as many teen comedies for example, that were straddling a fine line in terms of their classification from the BBFC. Many were definitely a PG, but often tiptoed a bit further, not quite into 15 territory, but certainly more than a PG would ever allow. To compensate this, a brand new rating was introduced in 1989 to help define and bridge that gap, the 12 rating.
This film has been classified 12. 12 films are suitable for older children. They may have stronger moments of violence or references to teenage experience, but nothing gratuitous. There may also be a swear word or two that you wouldn't hear in a PG movie.
Initially only being introduced to cinemas, the 12 rating, like its older siblings, denoted that anyone under the age of 12 not be admitted to said film. It was the final piece of a puzzle that the BBFC needed in order to truly define their rating system. And by 1994, the 12 rating was introduced and applied into the home video market also. So with the format now complete, would this be it? Would these symbols remain unchanged forever? Where could the BBFC possibly go next? The 1985 template, together with the 12 rating, would hold firmly throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, preceding every film that was screened in the UK and adorning the spine of every videotape that hit shop shelves. Over this period, audiences grew once again to become familiar with the ratings, the symbols that encapsulated them, and developed their associations with each one, regarding what kind of film they may be about to see or pick up. It seemed like there wasn't much room for any kind of improvement. But sure enough, in 2002, across both film and video, the BBFC rating symbols would undergo a little makeover. This is what they looked like from the mid to late 80s, and this is what they would become in 2002. Shapes remained the same, the text became a little bolder, and the colours a little lighter, but their meanings, their definitions, and their impact remained the same. But amazingly, there was yet another new addition to the family, one strictly for the cinemas. This was the 12A rating. Now you may be thinking, we already have a 12 rating, don't we? Why would we need a 12A? Well, the orange covered symbol denoted that no audience member under the age of 12 be allowed to see said film without the accompaniment of an adult. You may think surely this is what PG is for, but that's far from the case. The PG rating is essentially a U, but warning that some scenes may upset your kids. A 12A granted parents the choice to see the films they wanted, but also giving them the option to bring their potentially younger children along if they thought it suitable. But hey, it meant a sort of pseudo return for the good old A rating, so that's a small little victory for nerds like me and you who have a fascination with this sort of stuff. Honestly, the 12A rating has its fans and detractors, and is still perhaps the most contentious rating within the BBFC's lineup. After the 2002 revamp, things remained relatively the same for these symbols. The next alteration would come in 2009, but it only targeted one variant, specifically the child-friendly UC. After nearly a quarter of a century, the rating was abolished, and replaced with BBFC Insight. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful compared to the others, isn't it? This new variant denotes a similar meaning to UC, but focusing on material that's specifically suitable for preschool children, the youngest of viewers. Honestly, not sure why replacing UC had to look like this, but hey, here we are. The 2002 designs and format remained in place solidly throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Audiences knew these symbols, what they meant, what they stood for. So imagine many people's surprise in 2019 when the entirety of the BBFC logo lineup was overhauled yet again, from this design to this. Now, I'll hold my hands up, when this new style debuted, I was bitterly disappointed. I thought this was incredibly bare bones, that stripped back approach that was, and still is to some extent, dominating corporate branding as we know it. However, in the several years since their introduction, I've grown to love these little guys. They have a simplistic design, for sure, but with just the text and colour, there's absolutely no room for any misconceptions here. Also, the colour shades chosen for them are just fantastic. They pop exactly as they need to, and do look great on the certificates before each film. All of the ratings present in 2002, except for UC, are present and correct here in this new redesign. 12A is still used predominantly in cinemas, whereas the standard 12 rating is primarily used in the home video market. Would you believe that restricted 18 is still around too? Now simply R18. Its current definition explains that titles bearing an R18 rating be supplied only in licensed cinemas and sex shops? Oh boy. You can now definitely tell without any shadow of a doubt what types of titles are given an R18. It's not just a simple redesign that's been undertaken either. The rating symbols are now more animated, when included in little promos for the BBFC, and nowadays before the certificates themselves. I played it right at the beginning, but if you've been to the cinema recently, you've probably seen this little sequence. An incredibly lovely concept, one played out to perfection in a little over 10 seconds. The Chase creative consultants, the ones behind this rebrand, clearly understood the assignment and ran with it. As of 2025, this is still how the BBFC rating symbols look on both our cinema screens and on our home video releases.
These age rating symbols from the BBFC help you choose content well, in cinema, DVD and online.
They've been with us for more than a century, and in a way it's heartwarming to know that these little symbols, in some way, shape or form, are still a part of our movie-going experience. What initially began as an effort to enforce censorship transitioned to more of an advisory role, a friendly guide who could accurately and responsibly alert you to what kind of product you may be about to consume. I'm sure you'll have your favourites when it comes to the design of these little guys, but whatever that might be, one thing is clear: the BBFC rating symbols are here to stay, and at some point in the future, they will evolve and change once again. Into what, you ask? Well, for that, we'll just have to wait and see.
When you rent or buy a video, you need to know that the film you choose is suitable for the audience at home.
This film has been classified U. This film has been classified PG. That stands for parental guidance. This film has been classified 12. 12 films are suitable for older children. This film has been classified 15, which means it's unsuitable for anyone younger than that. This film has been classified 18, which means it's for adults only.
Video certificates are there to give you the chance to make the right choice. Thanks for listening.
Thank you to our patrons for helping to support the show, And a special thank you to Macra, Sean Knock, Dord Khan, Liam Domain, AJ Mac 200017, Deck, Jen, Traffy, Mr. Eurovision 1986, Evan Hart 42 Radio, Tim Ripley, 40-something Manchild, John McLeod, James Wallace, Ben, Stephen Oliver, Shadow Fiend 180X, Swan Ronson, Adam Gamer, Sir Fonzie Daz, Real Random, Tegan, Matthew Elif, Pigeon's House, Shah H, Dave Batten, Real Team Foxy Plays, Leonard Starbuck, Kevin Mallon, and Seed Diffusion, our AMTV staff members.